Matthew McConaughey is laying into his fellow Hollywood celebrities for their reaction to Donald Trump's loss in the 2020 presidential election. I'm Emily Jashinsky, culture editor at The Federalist.
I'm Kylee Zempel, assistant editor at The Federalist.
We're here to talk about what exactly is going on. Why don't you tell me a little bit about what McConaughey actually said?
Yeah, so McConaughey's on this podcast with Russell Brand, and he just started really laying into the left, mostly Hollywood elites, for basically accusing the right now of doing exactly what they did in 2016. So he's saying, one thing that he specifically said was that the right is critical of fake news and that they have been fed fake news. That was a highlight of his comments. But basically just that now it's their time to be skeptical of the results of the election, just as Hollywood elites have spent the last 4 years being critical of the results of 2016.
This is hilarious to me because it's not actually even just like the most common critique that we'll hear of Hollywood from Hollywood is just that they're out of touch and they're hypocritical. But this is like much more specific than that. And I hate clapping for any celebrity because they strung together a coherent sentence that actually makes a decent point or a cogent point about what's happening in the news right now. But McConaughey is completely correct. And what's notable is that he actually goes beyond this sort of easy criticism of Hollywood. And he's actually specifically saying your mindset is not exactly what you think it is. You're actually criticizing something that you yourself mirrored. And McConaughey, the broader context of all of this is that McConaughey is somebody who's really well respected in Hollywood. He started as kind of a rom-com actor that people might have joked about and then transformed into, Academy Award worthy, serious thespian.
Right. Well, and the thing is that he's not, these comments that he made, it's not like he's just sort of starting to be on to something, or that the things that he said are unintentionally a condemnation of Hollywood. I mean, the words he used, here's one of his quotes. There are a lot of people on that illiberal left that absolutely condescend, patronize, and are arrogant towards the other 50%. I mean, that's pretty strong language. It's not that he's accidentally making the right's case. He is outright saying that Hollywood leftists are in the wrong here. And he continues in that line, I'm sure you saw it in our industry when Trump was voted in 4 years ago. They were in denial that was real. Some of them were in absolute denial. Now it looks like Biden's our guy. Now you've got the right that's in denial because their side has fake news. And I understand they've been fed fake news. No one knows what the hell to believe, right? So they're putting down their last bastion of defense. I mean, these are real insights. These aren't just kind of offhand comments that he's pretending to know something about a demographic that he doesn't know anything about. These are pretty spot on points that he's making.
Well, I mean, he actually does know a lot about the demographic he's criticizing here, which is his fellow celebrities, right. And people in sort of elite circles. And something that's super interesting here is that he's talking on Russell Brand's podcast. And there's such a huge difference between somebody like Russell Brand critiquing Hollywood and Matthew McConaughey critiquing Hollywood, because Russell Brand is exactly the kind of person who will come out, and he has this long, winding, interesting, heterodox podcast in which he interviews notable figures and gets into these almost Rogan-esque conversations about deep issues, and he talks about some weird stuff, frankly. But there's such a huge difference between Russell Brand, somebody who is definitely liberal and, might get roles in Hollywood still, and McConaughey, who's actually really a powerhouse, right? This isn't, I'm trying to think of a good example of somebody who's just sort of there's a difference between Candace Cameron Bure doing this and Matthew McConaughey. And it highlights what a great conversation about the world we could have if people actually felt confident enough to talk openly. And right. That's what's amazing about these podcasts, whether it's Russell Brand or Joe Rogan or Federalist Radio Hour. It's that you give people a forum to really open up, and good on Matthew McConaughey for saying what he actually thinks, because, and by the way, at the heart of his critique is media criticism.
Right.
That's super interesting too. He's saying nobody knows what the hell to believe anymore.
And he's completely right. Is it also fair to say that, sure, he's ingrained in Hollywood culture, he's central to it. I mean, he's not like some fringe actor, like you said. But is it also fair to say that he knows the demographic that he's kind of representing back at the Hollywood elites? I mean, isn't he a Texas dweller? Like, I would imagine that he has a better understanding probably of the people who are currently feeling disenfranchised and who are frustrated with the leftist Hollywood elites for the last 4 years than maybe some other people who would talk back at Hollywood elites from being a Hollywood elite. And I think Matthew McConaughey also claims to be a Christian. He has been married for a number of years to the same woman. Like, he holds a lot of conservative values, it seems, although, is not necessarily a Trump supporter, but it seems that he knows the people that he's talking about, both on the Hollywood side and potentially the Trump voters.
Well, it's interesting that he's talking about the illiberal left, because talking about both the illiberal left and the illiberal right is something that is increasingly something that elites are comfortable doing, to sort of equivocate between the illiberal left and the illiberal right. And there's absolutely truth to that. But, there's a difference between the illiberal left and the illiberal right. And we've started to see, like from the Harper's letter, which had to take digs, and I think in some cases, understandably so, at the quote illiberal right, having the actual ability to say something about in criticism of the illiberal left, to me, it's amazing, because the illiberal left actually runs Hollywood and runs the media. So it's not like when you critique the illiberal right, it's like, what, are you taking a jab at a talk radio host in St. Louis? Or are you taking a jab at, what you think might be a really stupid article on the Federalist that was written by one of our contributors or our writers? There's a huge difference between criticizing that and criticizing a movie that people put multiple millions of dollars into, and everyone at the studio thought was a great idea, and was just like aggressively terrible to conservatives, or a famous actor saying something, or like these people who are at the head of these institutions.
Right.
It's a huge difference, and so good on McConaughey, because it's a difficult thing to do. Of course, it's not difficult when you have all the money in the world, but generally it's difficult.
Right. Well, no, that's a great point. I mean, the illiberal left runs Hollywood and the media largely, which is what he's also criticizing here. I do wonder whether there is kind of a trend of Hollywood closet conservatives, or just as Matthew McConaughey called for, was it aggressive centrists?
Aggressive centrists.
Yeah. Whether we're going to see any kind of pushback of any Hollywood personnel popping up and talking this way to Hollywood. There's a couple of figures of the same caliber as Matthew McConaughey, like Chris Pratt. We've seen him kind of pop up in recent months or years, maybe even, and doing the same thing. And I mean, it's not a large movement within Hollywood, but I just wonder whether more prominent figures that are more mainstream are going to be coming up kind of as the voice of reason, as part of their industry kind of declines.
Yeah, you raise a really good point, and this is something that is a huge focus, I think, of it. It should be a huge focus of culture coverage going forward, and people who pay attention to culture. There's always Chamber of Commerce Republicans that identify as Republicans in Hollywood. I imagine that would include people like John Voight and Gary Sinise, and et cetera, et cetera. But there's a younger crowd of millennial celebrities that may not be pro-Trump, but they're not left. They're in fact anti-left. They're anti-woke, and it's remarkable that we've seen some of the biggest celebrities in the country: Justin Bieber, Kanye West, and now McConaughey, Chris Pratt. Some of the biggest, most powerful celebrities in the world come out in, at least against the left. That's a huge trend. It's something to really pay attention to. But on that note, I'm Emily Jashinsky. She's Kylee Zempel.